Netflix's She-Ra has some really interesting approaches to mythology, folklore, and legends. The words myth and legend get thrown around a lot in the show, but where they show up is always of interest. She-Ra's approach to mythology isn't interesting because it's vastly different to what we may think, but rather because it remains very true to the way mythology is conceived and actualized in our non-fictional world as well. She-Ra gives us a lot to dig into when it comes to mythology, including the relationship between myth, history, and legend. It also shows us how myths can shift over time and gives us some level of insight as to why this occurs, including through the great influence colonizing powers have over the transmission of narratives. Before Adora even picks up the magical sword, the story of She-Ra is already a myth. According to several characters in the early episodes, there hasn't been a She-Ra in over a century, meaning the story of She-Ra has shifted from one of history to one of mythology. Several characters reference She-Ra as myth or legend, and both of these are contrasted starkly with the concept of She-Ra as historical. In many English-speaking countries, this is precisely how we view these three particular narrative types. Where myth and legend reside has no overlap with history. There is also the added difference between myth and legend themselves, where myth is often seen as that which is in a sacred time away from time, and legend is more loosely connected to history. In this mindset, the narrative flows from history to legend to myth. In reality, our narratives do not really work as neatly as this, nor are they as cleanly defined. Many times, narratives shift from one to the other and back again fluidly as we engage with narratives and bring them from one perception to another. Robin Hood, for example, may have at one point in time been a historical figure, but who has passed on to legend. If another national figure arises again who takes money from the rich billionaires of the world and attempts to spread that wealth to the lowest on the socioeconomic scale, we may once again revive the legend by connecting it inherently to this renewed historical figure. In fact, this is precisely what some scholars think happened to Robin Hood. Documents show outlaws using the name Robin Hood in a variety of forms, of course, into very early English history, the idea being that they would obscure their own identity with that of a legendary figure. These figures then become of interest and become intricately connected with the legendary figure themselves. For some, the original Robin Hood may have dated back to the Norman invasion in 1066, where figures fought to retain the original way of life for the Saxons, including their language and religion. But that's a completely different story for a completely another time. She-Ra throws another added complication into the early conversations around She-Ra. Legends, myths, and histories are not always known to the same extent by every member of society. Different generations and even different figures within those generations are going to understand, connect, and interpret these narratives regardless of where they fit into our neat linear scale of myth to history, but these happen in also very different ways. When Adora first transforms into She-Ra, Bow and Glimmer are equally confused as to what has happened. They don't recognize She-Ra or understand her relevance to the world. When She-Ra introduces herself to the Queen, however, the Queen knows instantly who she is and even interrupts She-Ra to name her before she can name herself. In fact, the Queen introduces She-Ra as the legendary She-Ra.
I know the legend of the warrior the first one's called She-Ra.
The use of the word legendary is important here. The Queen understands She-Ra as connected to history, but loosely, and perhaps to never be connected again. This is in direct contrast to Bow's dads, who also claim knowledge of the She-Ra story. In this episode, Bow's dads are portrayed as historians. Their knowledge base is rooted to the narratives as history rather than fanciful narratives, but they do understand the place of mythology and legend in their influence on and around history. In one conversation, they show an argument between the two of them over first one's mythological hero, where one believes it may be more rooted in history while the other does not. Bow's parents approach the She-Ra story not with cultural and social knowledge, but with history and an attempt at evidence. They are scholars of both myth and history rather than storytellers. The knowledge the older generation has of She-Ra in contrast to their children demonstrates how cultural knowledge can be lost through the progression of generations. With the exception of Perfuma, most of the characters around Adora's own age, or at least in their circle of friends, do not have the cultural knowledge of She-Ra. Many of their surprises at She-Ra's transformation is simply in the magical girl transformation, rather than in knowledge of the mythical figure that Adora embodies. Of course, the older generation's knowledge is also not united, but is fragmentary, and at times in contradiction. Even in our two examples we've already given, we see two primary differences in the understanding of She-Ra. The queen explicitly mentions that the first one said that She-Ra would return again at their greatest hour of need. But this particular part of the narrative or history is never referenced or explained again. This could be because of the queen's status as a divine being, which grants her access to a greater memory than that which she can hold by cultural memory, but a solid answer to this is never really provided. Where the queen's knowledge is passed down or a part of direct memory, the knowledge Beau's dads hold is more scholarly. These two approaches to the narrative can result in two different understandings and different tellings. This may be the reason why Beau's parents didn't mention the message from the first ones that She-Ra will return when Etheria needs it most. This may not be due to a transformation in the narrative so much as a difference in understanding. But that's not to say that transformations in the narratives are impossible. Transformations in narratives happen all the time, and for a variety of reasons. But most often, transformations in oral narratives are thought to be caused by a failure in memorization. The human brain simply forgets bits of information or misremembers other ones. But this may not be the truest understanding of oral transmission of narratives. Often these transformations happen actively and knowingly by the storyteller. We see this happen early in She-Ra. When first visiting Perfuma, Perfuma's people begin telling stories of the legendary She-Ra's mighty feats. Beau gets swept up in the moment and begins telling other narratives. While he does not hold the cultural memory of the older She-Ra tales, he does elaborate on the tales of the fights Adora has already taken on. While this does add a bit of a fun moment that has the added consequence of pressuring Adora, there is something else that we see in Beau's retelling of She-Ra. There is a purpose to Beau's tales. Perfuma's people are scared and worried about the potential loss of their homeland and the physical threat the evil horde represents. Their purpose of spinning the tales is not simply to hype up Adora or She-Ra for what they see as inevitable help she will provide, but because the cultural memory of someone who can do such feats is a symbol of hope in a very dire moment. Beau picks up on this and adds to the tales to continue to give them hope and to inspire them to continue to fight for themselves and their homeland, to allow them to live in the moment of peace and light when they have not had the ability to even dare to hope so much before. Alterations and added flair to narratives like Beau's happen all the time and for very similar reasons. Beau did not forget the events he's talking about, but he's actively choosing to add to them. Similarly, more traditional storytellers have throughout time actively chosen to alter the narratives they tell, not because they have forgotten, but because it is an alteration which suits the need for the time and context they find themselves in. Narratives of great princes and kings would not do well in the middle of the French Revolution, but rather great tales of ordinary people who rise to statuses of hero through their support to the poor. With this in mind, alterations to narratives can be used to fit the purpose, to inspire communities, or to dare once more to hope for better days. And Beau is not the only one to transform narratives in She-Ra to suit certain purposes. The biggest transformation of narratives occurs with the first ones, rather than the narrative of She-Ra specifically. The first ones were colonizers on the planet. They're described as the people who first came to the planet, but who eventually left, which is set in contrast to the indigenous population who seems to have no place in this historical telling of first ones to settle, a narrative many indigenous populations around the world may be able to relate to. While it is not explicitly mentioned, it is made clear that there were inhabitants to the planets prior to the first ones through Madame Raz's explanation that She-Ra existed long before the first ones came and connected everything through the princesses. This alludes to the presence of people who acted as princesses and She-Ra as already on the planet at the time of colonization.
But my people chose me to be She-Ra. I need the sword to control She-Ra's magic. That's what my superiors always told me.
Ha! She-Ra was here long before your people arrived.
Like most colonizers, the first ones stripped the planet of most of its natural resources. For Etheria, that resource is magic, and they crafted technology like the runestones to siphon magic and control it. Because of their superior technology and control over magic, which extends to the important ethereal figures like She-Ra and the princesses, the first ones quickly rose into a prominent position of power. Positions of cultural and social power presents the ability to change and alter narratives or understandings of narratives to fit their own purposes. We can think again of our relationship drawn between myth, legend, and history. We think of history as something evidential and factual, but history is as much a crafted story as fiction is. The fading of information, the alteration of ways stories are told, the choice to leave out certain details or pump up other details, are choices often made throughout history, and these are the stories which are then passed down. I think everyone is familiar with the phrase, history is written by the winners. And this understanding can be passed to our understanding of all narratives, including mythology. Returning to our Robin Hood narrative. If the historical roots of Robin Hood as someone fighting for the rights of the Saxons following a Norman invasion is true, then these origins have been scrubbed from the contemporary storytelling, with national identity replaced with generalizations of the poor. While this may be due to a passage of time, it could also be due to the continued power presence of the Normans, whose influence over the Saxons never waned and who forever changed the language, religion, and history of the British Isles. As colonizers, and colonizers with a great amount of power over the planet, She-Ra's first ones had great control over their own narratives and presentation in the narratives around them. We see glimpses of the way the first ones presented themselves, and how their legacy continued into their own mythic image. In Season 2, we see Adora and her friends stumble onto some holographic projections from where first ones were still living on the planet. Adora is surprised when they realize what these projections are.
So, these are first ones?
Yeah, why?
It's just... I've been thinking of them as these big epic figures, but they're regular people.
She expresses surprise that they are just people, which is an interesting commentary on the colonizer. The expectation is that first ones were somehow larger due to their own mythic image. This disconnect of what first ones actually are versus the image they are presented as in the narratives leads Adora to struggle to recognize her own genetic makeup as not from Etheria. The transformations of the first ones could have potentially been incidental through their own sheer powerful force in the world of Etheria. But their active transformation was enacted on the story of She-Ra. Through the show, She-Ra seems to be inherently tied to the first ones and their technology of the sword. The narrative of She-Ra became tied to the first ones, as is noted by the Queen's commentary on how the first ones spoke of She-Ra returning. But we learn later that She-Ra existed far before the first ones ever came to settle Etheria. The first ones needed to shift the narrative of She-Ra because it was an inherent part of their control over the magic and therefore She-Ra. If the actual enactment of She-Ra was inherently different from the narrative, it presents an aspect of possibility and potentiality which escapes the clutches of that which is outside the system of oppression and control. If Mara, for example, knew of the story of She-Ra as disconnected from first ones and princesses, she may have noticed an ability to escape the system before she actually did, and the same can be said of Adora as well. This is also not completely different from the way mythology works outside of fictional worlds as well. For example, our only connection to Norse mythology is through the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, which were written through the eyes of a Christian missionary, a form of colonizer whose view of the people and the narrative may not match up with the view of the people who shared the narratives before. This is now the only understanding of this narrative we have. We are only left with the first one's narratives, and not with the understanding, stories, and histories of the indigenous population. The experience of mythology and Netflix's She-Ra is complicated and intricate, and touches on many aspects of the understanding of mythology and storytelling outside of fictional circles. What makes She-Ra so fascinating is its ability to communicate complex understandings and complex characters in really simple and easy to digest ways. In some ways, She-Ra is the story of the silenced, oppressed, colonized, but one told through the eyes of the colonizer. And if we dig a little into it, we can see connections to ourselves and our own understandings of myth and story.